Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you folks about drip irrigation, kind of like one of my favorite things. You know, anything to do with irrigation, I typically enjoy working on. Since we're talking about irrigation today, I know that there's going to be a bunch of questions, and it's okay. I might interrupt the class and just answer a question if it's timely. But if you feel like you need to, if you can, just hold your questions until the end, and we'll leave enough period, hopefully, to answer everyone's questions. So I just want to ask, first of all, who's here because they're wanting to do some drip irrigation at their house? That's great. And of those that are doing drip irrigation at their house, are you typically doing drip irrigation for things that are in the ground like ornamental plants, or are you wanting to do drip irrigation in raised beds for edibles and vegetables and things like that? A little bit of both? Okay. Raised beds. Okay. Well, I enjoy doing both. I can tell you that inline drip is the latest evolution in drip irrigation, and it appears to be the most efficient. It's the most forgiving, in my opinion. It's the easiest to modify when you kind of know what you're doing. So let me just take a step back and just explain the difference between inline drip irrigation, which is what you see in these beds here in front of you, versus point source. So point source irrigation is going to be, single drippers such as these. I'm just going to take one out. I'm going to pass this around. It's just like my junk container of different drip emitters. You can see there's bunches of different types. There's drip emitters, single point source drip emitters like this one that they continue to drip water after each irrigation. So you can get a drip emitter like this that has a check valve so that it does not drip water at the end of an irrigation cycle. I think that those are the higher quality drippers that have check valves in them. And then you can get, typical drippers that are called pressure compensating, so that, at the beginning of the line and at the end of the line, the drippers get the same rate of flow through each of the emitters. And that's really helpful if your landscape isn't all flat. If you've got some mounds and berms and slopes and things, you'll want to have pressure compensating at a minimum, so that you can at least be applying the same amount of water to each dripper. But again, with those situations, check valves become very useful because they keep the water in the drip tubing at the end of an irrigation cycle. And if you happen to be on a slope, we have this thing in the industry called low head drainage. And if you've got a dripper that's down at the bottom of a slope and it does not have a check valve, it will continue to leak out and leak out and leak out all of the water that's in your tube, and you get a big wet spot at the bottom, and it's not good. So I encourage people to seek out the best equipment. And if you have any questions, I'm sure you can always reach out to me via text, email, or what have you. And I also encourage you to use your irrigation suppliers, the local irrigation suppliers. As far as point source irrigation, it's still useful in a lot of instances. Even if you're using a grid pattern of inline irrigation like you see here, there are certain instances where, there's just a grid didn't fit. There's a little weird shape in your landscape and you couldn't get the grid quite in there. There's always a place for a good emitter in your irrigation system. So a lot of people frown on point source emitters anymore. I would say I frown on the bad ones. The good ones are okay. Just to take an aside, I did a irrigation inspection yesterday over in Fair Oaks, and they had a system that was installed about 20 years ago, and they used all rain drip. If you know that name brand, you can find it at Lowe's and Home Depot. Rain drip drip emitters, and I'd say 90% of those emitters were flawed. I mean, they just were shooting water like it was completely unrestricted. And that's terrible. They're going to wind up replacing their entire system. So I would encourage you, again, get good components and don't buy the cheap stuff because you pay more in the long run. Okay. So that's kind of enough about point source irrigation, but I'm even going to back up a little bit further and talk about drip irrigation in general and what some of the requirements are. Like there's safety stuff, like what I'm wearing. Typically, you're not standing up and working on raised beds all the time. You're kind of down on the ground and in shrubs and things. So I've learned I'm always wearing long sleeves. I never wear shorts. I always have my gloves on. There's always critters and bugs and stuff. And keep your hat on, keep protected from the sun. And that's, the other thing, knee pads. I use this type, and I use a few of them, to be honest, because when I'm down on the ground, I like to be comfortable. And those knee pads that I pull behind my knees are uncomfortable for me. I can slide this thing around and move pretty quickly. So I encourage people, if you're going to be out on your knees, use a knee pad, and just kind of show you what I do. So again, when you're using drip irrigation, you're going to have these two components. You've got a Y filter, and inside that Y filter is a little screen, and what it does is collect impurities that otherwise would go down the line and could clog the small orifices on the drip emitters. It's not typically just a hole. There's a labyrinth of little restrictors and things like that you don't want to get clogged. And these little mesh filters do an excellent job of keeping debris from getting down the line and clogging your drip system. If you're using Citrus Heights water, I'm sure it's fairly clean. If you happen to be using a well or any other secondary water source, it becomes ultra important that you filter your water. And most drip irrigation systems are designed to run on reduced water pressures. So typically they run between 20 and 40 psi is kind of optimal. And I would say that the water that comes out of your tap, or the water that would immediately come out of this valve, is going to be, about 45, 50. It just depends on where you are in the service area, but it's always higher than what's required for drip irrigation. So there's this other component, which is a pressure reducer. Different than a pressure reducing valve, for which you get a rebate for. That's a brass unit, and it will reduce the pressure in your whole water system at your house. This one's specific for the drip valve and zone that you're irrigating. So this is also a component that's required to make sure that your drip irrigation is in the proper pressure range. Okay. And when we're talking components, right here is a good place for me to talk about, what do you do when you have to transition from your pressure reducer over to the drip irrigation? And there's a number of different components that allow you to do that. And see, I brought the bag without that one. But I'll run over to my truck and get one so that I want to be sure that you understand there's lots of different ways that you can transition from the valve to the actual drip tubing out in the field. Okay, so again, that's what's going to be required at the beginning of each drip irrigation circuit if you're doing it at the valve. Some people elect to convert an old spray zone. It used to be lawn, or it used to be pop-up sprays, and you can convert one of those old sprayers and make that the beginning of your drip irrigation system. What you'd have to do is locate all of the sprays and cap off all except one. And once you get down to that one, there's a component. This one I didn't open yet, but I'll pass it around so you can see it. This acts like basically a sprinkler head. So you can undo one of your sprinkler heads and screw this on, and there's a place on the top and a transition kit that allows you to go from this device to the drip irrigation and then out into your landscape, and you can water from that. So I'm going to hand this one around, and you can see that. Also going to hand this around other directions so you can see that. Thank you. So now, we've talked a little bit about point source irrigation. I'm going to talk about inline drip irrigation right now. Inline drip irrigation is fabulous because it doesn't break. It can fail, you know, if critters chew into it or if a shovel goes through it when you're doing your gardening, but by and large, it is way more durable than using the little 1/4 inch, what we call spaghetti tubing, going from a main line and a dripper over to a plant. Those tend to get pulled out all the time when raking. And if you rake that and you pull the device out of the main line, you wind up with one of those geysers, and you know you've got to have goof plugs and things to get that repaired. You typically aren't going to have any issues like that with this because there's nothing, you know, to break off of it. The emitters, the drip emitters, are built into the tubing during the extrusion process, and they can be in different flow rates for different types of soil. So this particular line emits 0.6 gallons per hour through each one of these emitters, these holes, and these emitters are placed 12 inches apart on the tubing. They make the emitters flow rates as low as 0.26 gallons per hour. So if you got heavy clay soil that doesn't soak the water in very fast, you want to apply it slowly. So you'll have to, you know, get the drip tubing that has the emitters with the slower flow rates. That also applies if you're on a slope. You don't want to apply the water too fast to a slope because it will run down, so you want to get a slower flow rate for those applications. In addition, you can get these emitter spacings in different spacings. These are 12 inches apart, which I tend to use. I like using 12 inches, but you can get them spaced apart 18 inches, 24 inches, even up to 36 inches. So if you've got really mature trees that you're, you know, going to put some rings around, you don't need to be, you know, so concerned with every 12 inches, as long as you're getting that water under the canopy, and you can just have a high flow rate, but, you know, wide spacing on the emitters, and it does a good job for, you know, large mature trees and such. But let me pass this around so people can get a feel.
Is your main line, or you're connecting that to your main line?
This is not main line, but I did bring some main line with me. This particular main line, and pardon me, I didn't have all of this kind of prepared in advance, so I'm just kind of cutting into the things. But it's good that you get to see how it gets done. Just be careful. I've got, you know, the special tool and things, and I've been doing it for a while. I have to caution everyone. So the difference with the main line, obviously, is that it doesn't have any holes, no emitters in it, and it's just used to bring the water from the valve to the point where you're going to need to start emitting water. This particular main line, the black one that you see here, is you know, you'll probably find this at Home Depot or Lowe's or any big box store that you shop at. They don't carry inline drip tubing, and maybe we'll just transition a little bit here to the different sizes of tubing. That inline drip tubing that's going around right now is kind of industry standard. It's 17 millimeters. It's like a little bit bigger than 1/2 inch, a little smaller than 5/8. It's not exactly the same size as this, and the fittings are not the same. If you were tried to use these fittings on those, you couldn't get them to work, and they just blow apart. So you have to be careful on what tubing that you're using for distribution tubing to get to the inline. You can get the 17 millimeter tubing That's distribution only with no holes, but you have to go to an irrigation supplier. They don't carry it at Home Depot or Lowe's. I'm sorry?
Online.
Absolutely.
Amazon.
You can certainly go to Amazon or any of your other, just do a search and you'll probably find plenty of folks online. But it's important to just make sure that you get the right connectors. I carry this, it's my kind of like work satchel, and I've got 17 millimeter T's in the middle, 17 millimeter elbows on one side, and 17 millimeter couplings on the other, and I use those throughout the day when I assemble irrigation grids. I would tell you it's a good idea if you're a homeowner and you're going to be doing your own irrigation, have a kit. And keep all that stuff together in a kit, and when you're done, keep it all together, because when you need it, and you don't want to have to go looking. I can quickly, at a scan, see what my inventory looks like, and know if I need to stop at the store before headed to a job site. So in my kit, staples, you're going to need those, and I got to tell you a little bit about inflation. Before COVID, a bag of 100 of these staples was $8. I cannot get it for less than $13 now. So such is the way of things. So again, I've got a hammer here. You might need to use that when you're pushing your staples into the soil, depending on your soil. What you'll notice about my hammer, got this little white tape there, and that tells me how far apart to space my grids. There's a little notch here on the hammer. It goes right where I put a staple in, and this measurement is just about 11 inches, maybe 10 and a half. And I found that at 10 and a half inches, it does a very, very good job of keeping plants in the middle watered, and you don't have to be so concerned about the chance of them drying out. I would tell you there's plenty of charts that are out there that will tell you how far apart to space your rows, but I get a lot of questions about, well, how long should I run my drip system? And there's a lot of answers to that question, but when we're using inline grids, we can really calculate it kind of easy. And there's a chart out there that will tell you if you use the inline drip that we passed around with 0.6 gallon per hour emitters spaced every 12 inches, if you place those rows 12 inches apart, you achieve 0.96 inches per hour of water in that area. So it's just under 1 inch per hour. That's why I space mine about 10 and a half inches apart, and I can achieve 1 inch per hour. And that tells me how long I need to run my system. In the middle of July in Sacramento, most in-ground stuff needs about, I'm going to give you a range, 2 to 3 inches of water per week. So if it takes 1 hour to apply an inch of water with a grid of this tubing, and you need 2 to 3 hours a week, that you need to be running that system 2 to 3 hours per week in order to adequately apply 2 inches of water. So it's easy to tell people how long to water and how often if I know what was installed and if it was installed properly. But when you get to this situation where you have point source emitters, a couple of emitters at each plant, I don't know if those emitters are a half gallon per hour or if they're 2 gallon per hour, because they sell all three, or they sell those and 1 gallon per hour emitters at all of the big box stores. And, I don't know what the installer put there. Okay, so when we're installing the drip irrigation, I want to give people an opportunity to understand what it's like to put them together, because that'll tell you whether or not this is a project that you want to do yourself, or if you might want to have some help with or hire some people, because I've had folks tell me that it's too difficult to install your irrigation fittings. So I just want to show you what I do all the time. and here's a T, and here's a piece of tubing, and I'm just gonna always be doing this. I take my T and I insert the beginning of it there into the tube, and I get it started, and I just kind of wiggle it back and forth, and it's all the way on there. And I can tell you what doesn't work is spinning it. This thing doesn't have like threads or anything, so it won't do that. It's got barbs. So walking it down the pipe is pretty easy to do. I'm going to let folks give that a try, and I'm going to talk while I cut this apart, okay, because I want you to see how to do it. Tubing cutters. If you're going to be doing it, what also works are your Felco pruners or whatever pruners that you use. If you keep them in good repair, they double as good tubing cutters. But if you don't have a good pair, I would tell you invest in something that's specifically made for cutting tubing because it works like that. I've seen people try scissors. I've seen people try a box knife. I don't understand it, but this is definitely the way that you want to go. A PVC cutter. Okay. It works, but they ratchet. So, you've got to, it's going to take forever to cut the tubing. And without the ratchet, you can just cut it. And it's just like that. So I'm just going to take a few of these. And if you care to, I'm going to pass around a couple of, stand up straight. Pass around a couple of pieces of tubing from each side, and some fittings go around. And anyone who wants to give it a shot can try putting in fittings. Don't worry about reusing them. I can reuse these fittings. The other thing I should mention is that when you buy this new tubing, it's going to be in this big coil. What I always do is the first thing I do when I get to a job site is find the sunniest spot and open up my tubing and uncoil it and let it lay out there and straighten out. Because it's much easier to work with when it's not trying to recoil against you all the time. Okay. Any other questions that before we forget? Absolutely. Maybe I should pass this. Yeah, I'll pass my bag around and make it available to anyone who wants to. It's kind of heavy. I don't want anybody to drop it. Is it too heavy? Oh gosh, let me put it right here. And anybody can walk up and grab a fitting if they need to.
Does this replace all waterings except for grass? Or you can't do grass, right?
Let me just let you know the question was, does inline drip irrigation replace all watering, even grass? And I can say absolutely. There's a number of lawns that I've done that have subsurface irrigation, but the key, again, is to keep the spacing between the rows a little less than 12 inches. Oh, well, it goes down 12 inches. You typically aren't going to have a lawn there when you install this irrigation. It goes in first, and then the soil, and then it's about 6 inches below the actual turf.
These ones are on top, right?
Exactly. Right. So she brings up a good point about burying drip irrigation versus having it on the surface. And I can tell you that in my experience, I almost never will bury drip irrigation. I don't like to have my drip irrigation under anything except mulch. Because if you ever have to make a modification, if you need to add to it, who wants to dig into the dirt to find it and then risk the infiltration of the dirt into the tubing when you're trying to make a modification? So the standard is to on the surface get everything just as nice as you can, install the drip irrigation on the surface stapled every no more than 2 feet apart, and then cover that drip irrigation with a proper mulch. And the mulch that you see here in these beds is perfectly adequate. There's all kinds that you can use, but I would say use enough. No less than 3 inches, and up to 5 inches is perfectly fine.
So doesn't the exposed break because of the sun?
That's
If it's not.
if it's not covered, the tubing does degrade from the UV radiation. Just being exposed to the sunlight is. Oh, I'm sorry. That's
Oh.
my fault. Let's put that down. Anyway, the sunlight does degrade the tubing, and it takes some years for it to happen. But the idea is to not leave it exposed. So you're going to be remulching. Hopefully, you don't have the blower situation that a lot of folks have, and the mulch gets blowed away all the time. But I encourage folks to stay on top of it. If you keep that mulch layer no less than 3 inches, you're not going to have an issue. Everett mentioned that he had heard about fertilization in inline drip tubing, that when using inline, perhaps you should use a liquid fertilizer as opposed to granular, because the granules can eat at the irrigation tubing. This is the first I've heard of that, but I suppose that it could happen. My reason for supporting a liquid fertilizer when using inline drip irrigation is different. It's because the watering pattern, to actually dissolve the granules, it happens really easily when you have overhead spray. The droplets everywhere help to dissolve those granules. But with drip irrigation, you see a wet spot on the surface. That wet spot, acts like a cone as it goes down, so it gets wider. But on the surface where the granules are, you may not see water everywhere, so those granules may not get dissolved unless you're doing some sort of an overhead spray. So I think when using inline drip, particularly with hard soils, I would say that the liquid fertilizers are probably better, and they're more fast acting. I kind of like them. A combination of the two. So that being said, let's. I want to do a couple of more transitions, like when we're moving around from the black mainline tubing, which is what most people are going to have. Some of the distributors, the irrigation distributors, have this really cool fitting. It's actually Ewing irrigation makes this one, that allows you to transition from the black to the brown, and it's nice because they show you the color to add things to, and this shows you that the brown fitting is an insert fitting, but the black one is what we call a compression fitting. And this one you actually have to squeeze into the pipe. It's the same kind of wiggling motion, but it doesn't go inside the pipe. If we were to try to insert this black one in there, I literally could pull it out, and when the water came on, it would blow it apart. So that's why it's important to not use these insert fittings for the black tubing. When you pressurize your system, it's going to leak and or blow out. Again, when it comes to maintenance, the irrigation filter that I mentioned earlier, once a year you're going to go through your system and run it manually for about 30 minutes. And the idea is to go look at all of your emitters. Like I discovered over there in Fair Oaks that all of those emitters were, they're buried under mulch, but you hear a psst, and you have to go and figure it out. And it's like, okay, these emitters are no good. Well, part of the idea with this irrigation is that you have to do an inspection. That inspection starts at the filter. We're going to take this out, pull the filter screen out, and just a simple bucket of water and a toothbrush is going to be enough to put this back. I tend to have my hose with me because if there's little grit and things that are in these threads, they will degrade the O-ring. So it's just one of those things you want to kind of keep clean when you're threading and unthreading, and that will prolong the life of it. No maintenance is going to be required on your pressure regulating filter, on your pressure regulator. When it comes to pressure regulating filters, I should mention. what I've shown you so far were two-piece. You'll find a separate filter and a separate pressure regulator. What's become popular these days are this combo unit. A combo unit combines both the pressure regulator and the filter. So it's got the same kind of screen, but there's a little relief valve built into the side, and that allows it to maintain a consistent pressure. So you can basically get a more compact assembly. So just pass that one around so you can see that one as well.
One better than the other?
Well, I can tell you that the question was one better than the other? There are certain situations, like if you have extremely low flows, you've got one valve that only waters 4 or 5 potted plants, as opposed to the valves that water your entire landscape. Well, they make these pressure regulators, this part here, with different specifications. This particular one says that it can run from 0.25 to 15 gallons per minute at 30 pounds per square inch. Well, they make some that run from 1 gallon on. So they're constructed differently inside. So if you have an outlier, something that doesn't conform to the normal standard installations, you might have to go with the separate. If you have like a small zone, very small zones would be the ones that I would say you'd want to go to a separate. But by and large, most people are able to get away with just a single. I should mention a little bit about hydro zones. Most folks will have a single drip line that goes around their landscape and waters basically everything. They've got one line that goes around, and even though they've got some gardenias that like a little bit more water and some lantanas, everything gets the same schedule. And that's not ideal, but it's what a lot of people have. When you run into a situation like that, you might want to use a different flow rate or a different point source emitter for the different plants that have a higher water need versus a lower water need. So remember earlier I talked about the different emitters. You can get them as low as 0.3 gallons per hour flow rate, and some go up to, upwards of 2 gallons per hour or 5 gallons per hour. Once you've determined that, you can, the higher water use plants, give them a higher flow rate dripper, knowing that you're going to wet it all, evenly at the beginning. But then when your system comes on, it's going to apply more water to the more thirsty plants. This is not ideal. This is what we call, I'm just going to help this system along. But most folks that would call me will ask me, well, what is ideal? And in that situation, what we like to do is dedicate a valve for those plants that have a higher water need, and a different valve, for instance, for plants that have lower water needs. And I tend to do that at most, if not all of my installations. And I wind up not using the black tubing because now I've got 2 different water sources. And if I've got those 2, I'd use a darker brown for my tubing that has no holes in it. The darker brown will indicate that it's wetter. And there's a lighter brown tubing, also with no holes, that will go to the plants that like it a little bit drier. So that when you encounter the tubes in the landscape, you know which one that you want to connect to. If there were 2 black tubes running around your landscape, and you were thinking that you choose the right one, you'd miss 50% of the time. I know it. I've done it. So I've now come up with that idea of, you may see as many as 3 different drip lines, or even 4, for instance, on a project of mine, but each of them are distinguishable because they look different. The lines that emit the water might look the same, but the lines that carry the water are going to be different, and they each represent a different schedule. And just to give you an idea, if we're in the middle of summer right now, My more often or more frequent watering line is watering every other day. Every other day. The less frequent is every 4 days. So we've got mature stuff in the landscape, a hedge, even my citrus are on the less often. They run every 4 days now. And most things in the ground are every other day. If you're in a raised bed, that's even every other day. The only thing that's getting watered every day throughout the summer is a pot. So when it comes to your timing, truck go by. When it comes to your timers, each one of your programs, program A, B, or C, represents a different schedule. In my case, would represent one of the different color tubings. So my program A, the most frequent things, is going to be perhaps my black tube. I'm sorry, the dark brown tube, because that's it represents wetter. And then the hedges and things that don't require as frequently will be the lighter brown tubing. And again, different schedule, A and B or C. There are some resources that I would like to bring to your attention. I have them on my laptop, but I can just tell you the water side, the websites. bewatersmart.info. If you can write that one down, bewatersmart.info. This is a great resource for you when it comes to efficiency tools, and one of my favorite ones that's on there is the Sacramento Area Irrigation Scheduler. This electronic tool allows you to input various characteristics about your landscape and where you're located with your zip code, the sprinkler type, the drip type, and what's being watered. And it will give you a schedule, how long you should be watering, how often you should be watering. And the person who developed it, Lori Palmquist, is almost world renowned. She's an excellent irrigator, and she's based in the Bay Area, and she's very resourceful. Provides a lot of tools for water districts throughout the United States. And that's one that she provided for the Sacramento area, and a lot of folks don't know about it, so I encourage you, please take a look at that, and you'll be able to link to it. I think there's a link on your, is there a link?
There is on our website, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So remember to refer back to that, because it's one of the most helpful resources that you'll be able to look back on. Okay, a grid with the inline drip. Let's do, I'll talk a little bit about it while I make it. The idea behind a grid is that you're going to get a consistent watering pattern. If I could show you a photo, you'd see that there'd be evenly spaced dots like all over this area of DG with a grid installed. The idea with a grid, if you can see a little bit here where these dots are, is that the first row, you can see that there's an emitter here and an emitter here. The second row that goes on, the idea is to keep the emitters offset so that the next emitter forms like a triangle. If you notice, there's an emitter here, the next one's here, and then the next one's here. So they're going to be offset about like that, so that when you achieve the grid, no matter what the dimensions are, you'll see the pattern in the soil, and that pattern is such that when you plant between the rows, the wetness is going to reach from dot to dot. Ultimately, when you run it for the proper period of time, you'll see it dots in the beginning, but ultimately those dots will touch each other. And if you've got a plant in the middle, it's going to get watered from all sides, as opposed to a single emitter at the base of a plant. It works wonderfully when you're planting new plant material to put a single emitter at the base of a plant. But the thing is, that plant's going to grow, and that root system wants to grow, and it doesn't want to keep getting water right there at the base, because that leads to rot, of the crown of the plant. The idea is that if you're doing point source irrigation, when it was done properly, there'd be 2 emitters to each plant. The emitter would be poked into the actual drip tube, the black distribution tubing, and then the spaghetti tubing would come from the emitter and go over and be staked in on either side of the plant so it can evenly wet the root ball from both sides. That still works. You know, most people just don't do it that way. They kind of run the drip tubing right along the plant and stick an emitter in right there into the 1/2-inch line, and now it's stuck there because it's right at the base of the plant. So it's much better if you're using the grid pattern. It's just the evolution, like I mentioned earlier. Over years, you know, folks have discovered that you do much better for your landscape by keeping all of the soil moistened. I mean, if you think about it, it's a living environment, and you'd want, you know, if you're interested in the entire landscape being healthy, you'd want that the soil life and the microbials to be getting their moisture as well. So I think vast expanses of just dry are not, you know, healthy. I kind of like using a grid system, even if I'm not going to do a dense planting. I like, you know, a grid to make sure that the whole area is getting wet, and then maybe a more dense grid where there's plant material. So I think that there's really no application for which inline doesn't work. I think inline drip irrigation is probably the most efficient that you can install right now. It's great to install it, you know, new landscapes. It's a little bit more difficult if you've got, for instance, like this bed. You know, it's fully, you know, you can't get down to the soil level, so it doesn't lend itself, and it's one of those situations where you're going to have to wait until the time of year when the bed's clear. People do extensive pruning in the fall, and they might put off a project like a transition from point source drip to inline drip. They might put it off until the time when they know that their landscape's going to be a little more clear, and you're able to get down to the soil to install it properly. Yes, ma'am.
This is going to sound dumb, but I know nothing about drip.
Mm-hmm.
I have a valve like that in my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
Where do I hook up the main line?
The main line, okay.
I mean, the black one.
Right. That was the what I mentioned. There's a transition that's
So
in my
it's right
truck.
in there.
Yeah. No, it's in my truck. There's a fitting, and there's one of those situations where you want to go to an irrigation supplier to know, you know, what's the proper way for you to install. This just sticking up out of the ground, if you've got a single valve, and you just come right off of this and go to drip irrigation, and I've done it many times, this part is a little bit wobbly. It's not very stable. There's lots of folks that would prefer, I want to come straight down into the ground and put some PVC there for stability, and then from the PVC they come back up and there's their drip irrigation. So there's,
So the black line would come out of that after your fitting that's in your truck.
yes,
And then you would transition to the brown in line.
that's correct. Yeah, somewhere down the black tube just takes water to wherever it's going to be used. Once it gets there, you've got a choice to make. You're going to use inline drip irrigation. There's different fittings like that one that's on black. That's black on one end and brown on the other. Is an excellent fitting that allows you to transition from the black to the brown. If you go to the all brown, then you don't have to worry about, you know, that transition from the black tubing to the brown.
So I could go right from the valve
To the brown.
I don't need the black.
You don't need to use black. I mean, my point is that there's tubing that has holes and there's some that does not. And you're going to want to have the tubing without holes immediately after the valve until you need water.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes.
Isn't that little piece, that little next one over, doesn't that reduce the pressure for the thing?
Okay, the question was a valve question. This little part right here, there's a little knob that goes on top of it, but you can turn and open that. That's a little valve. It's just a flow control. It may seem like it's reducing the pressure, but it's not. It's reducing the flow. and you could actually reduce it all the way down to stop the water from flowing. And it's a great valve for that reason. From time to time, debris gets caught under your diaphragm, and you might have water leaking at one of your sprinkler heads or something. It's like, hey, the system's not running. Why is that continuing to leak? It's low. It's because there's been some debris that's keeping the diaphragm from fully closing, and as such, you could turn that flow control on the top, just turn it all the way down, and that would stop the leak until the diaphragm could be cleaned or repaired. I could give a whole class on valve selection, and because there's so many choices, and people have too many choices, and they're not sure, and they've heard Rainbird so many times. Oh, let's get to the Rainbird. Unfortunately, Rainbird would be the least desirable valve for me. And I've been in Rainbird's catalog, so I mean, I'm not just prejudiced against them, but I just think that this valve is the most forgiving and the easiest to work on for most homeowners. And I would encourage people to use this Irritrol 2711 APR, and they're not paying me for saying that. Yes, sir. Any other questions? Yes.
Can you talk about the length of your drip line and whether there's a limit?
There is. I'd say that the limit is roughly 200 gallons per hour, right? So if you think about, I could say that there's a limit as far as distance, how many linear feet, but most homeowners at a typical homeowner site aren't going to achieve, the limit, the outer limits there, but they might achieve the flow limits. So if you think about 1 gallon per hour emitters, and you do 2 per plant, that's 2 gallons per hour. You could probably do 100 plants, off one drip line. And that's kind of the way I would look at it. If you're looking at the inline drip tubing, you can calculate that out as well. It's 0.6 gallons per hour every foot. So you take 200 divided by 0.6, and that would tell you how many feet that you could go, linear feet of drip tubing on a particular valve. Once you've reached that, you want to split your system up, split that landscape up, and say, okay, we're going to have to divide that up and put in another valve in order to pick up the rest of that area. Because you can reach the limits. I've got a house out in Carmichael, very big property. I tried to do everything I could to maximize it, and we went down to the very end, and I think about the last 15 feet, 20 feet of that project, there was nothing coming out of those drippers, and nothing. So we had to make a modification. And we did it, and we changed up some tubing, and then we finally were able to get it. So that's the max, and that's a really big property. So I doubt most folks will run into that situation. More questions?
Do you have to have a filter on your drip line?
Yes. If I didn't mention it, the question was, is a filter required? And that's one of the things I touched on early on, is that you must have filter for drip irrigation, because it will catch any small impurities that could otherwise clog the orifices. They're very, very small on those emitters that are built in, and you don't want anything clogging them. And it's important to keep these clean. Just check them once a year. Yes?
I already have a system with the black tubing.
Yes.
With emitters for each plant.
Uh-huh.
Unfortunately, I just installed it a month ago, so I missed your class.
Okay.
So my question is, and I got a number of plants from Green Acres,
Mm-hmm.
and on the outside it gives you the water requirement.
Right.
And some of them say low.
Correct.
Some of them say moderate.
Right.
Now I've got drippers. I got a half gallon, a gallon, and 2 gallon drippers.
Right.
So what size dripper should I use for the low requirement, and what size should I use for the moderate?
It depends. No, it's all. I honestly would want to say. I know I wasn't going to say that. I honestly would tell you that you just put these plants in the ground.
Like 2 weeks ago.
I honestly would tell you, if you did it correctly, you would have took put the emitter in the black tube. The black tube's a little bit away from the plant, maybe a foot or two. And then from the emitter, the dripper, you ran some spaghetti tubing over to the plant and staked that spaghetti tubing so that it emits over there.
I ended up running the 1/2-inch tubing off of the main black tubing.
And then put the emitter at the end?
Yeah.
That's very easy to fix. That's very simple to fix. If you just take it off and do it the other way, what that allows you to do is reposition the end of the tube where the water emits. And I would tell you that you're perfectly fine. People have done it for a long time, the way that you're doing it. And it works. But I would have 2 emitters per plant, not just one, and give myself room to move those emitters as the plant grows, and then I could add another emitter if I need to.
So I've done that.
Okay.
I've got 2 emitters for each plant. But still, my question is, on the plants that say low water,
Right.
The sign on it said,
Got it.
low water.
Got it.
Do I put a 1/2 gallon emitter or 1 gallon? I put
What-
a 1/2 gallon, not really knowing what I was doing.
I understand. So for getting the plants established, and he's just in case nobody heard, he's planted a new landscape and he's put 1/2 gallon per hour emitters on his plants. Some of his plants say that they're low water, some say moderate when he bought them at the nursery. So ideally, the low waters would all be together on one valve. You'd have one line that went and did all the lows.
I only have 1 valve source.
Right. So here's my approach to make the best of your situation. Is I would keep my half gallon per hour emitters to get all of my plants established because they're all brand new, which means that you don't water them as though they were low or moderate when they're first planted. You're going to water them like, hey, these are new plants and we've got to keep them healthy. So that means you're going to overwater them to a certain degree for the first 6 months. After that first 6 months, you're going to start to change the number of emitters that are on those different plants. So the ones that say that they're moderate, I wouldn't change. I would leave those alone. But the ones that say that they're low, if they say that they're low, I wouldn't change them. But if they say that they're moderate, I might add an additional 1/2 gallon per hour emitter for those that say that they're moderate. If you've got one that says that it's high, I would add an additional, one more or a 1 gallon per hour in addition for those plants if they have to run off the same valve. And this is as they mature. You'll find that as they mature, they run at the same time, but the thirstier plant's going to want more water to stay happy. So the low waters will continue to stay on their 1/2 gallon per hour as the plants mature. And then the moderates would get an additional 1/2 gallon per hour emitter. But the higher water use, if they say that they're higher water use, they get an additional. And that way you can give more to the ones that require more water.
So I kind of want to cut off the questions
Uh-oh.
there. So we're at time. If I don't know, you said you kind of wanted to hang around
And do some transitions.
yeah,
Yes.
that would be great if you guys want to hang around for that. Just kind of close it off there. Just a big round of applause for Johnny. I think he did a great
Thank you.
job. If you have any recommendations for classes, please come see me and let me know. We want to put on classes that you guys want to come to. So if you have a recommendation, let me know. We find that really valuable, and we want to put out information that you're interested in.
Can I add one piece? They have a rebate program or a special program to install beehive timers.
Yeah.
I install beehive timers regularly. It's my favorite system to install. Most customers really love it. It pairs with a Flume home water sensor device so that you can see what your gallons per usage are in your system. It's a fabulous system. It doesn't cost a lot. I encourage you, take advantage of the system that they have available to you in your district. It's a good one.
So for our program, you just get the controller, and you'd have to buy the Flume separate and connect it that way.
Yeah.
But so yeah, you could get a free smart irrigation controller, pairs to your phone like he's saying, through the program. It takes a little bit of scheduling. You have to do a water audit first just to make sure that there's not any deficiencies in your system, such as a leak, and you'd have to repair any of those. And then once that's done, you can get it. It's just scheduling. It takes about 2 weeks to a month to finally get it in. So you just got to be patient with the process.
And I do have business cards for everyone if you're interested. I'm gonna have them right here, so you can just grab some on your way out. Name of my business is Grass Kissers, by the way.
It's called what?
Grass Kissers. And there's some cards for you. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.